Hello there. In this video, we're talking to you about democratic backsliding in Poland, more specifically about how the discrimination against LGBT and minority groups are part of a wider package of democratic backsliding that we've seen in recent years. So, ever since 2015 and the election of the Law and Justice Party under the leadership of Kaczynski, I've definitely said that name wrong, but alongside him you've got President Duda, for example. So under this regime, there has been significant policy change and shifting towards democratic backsliding. So this has taken place through, for example, the control of the media institutions, where the private sector and state-run media has become much more favourable towards the incumbent party because they've taken more executive control over it. This is important for democracy because it means opposing voices are less upheld. They have less of a say, and the networks for opposing voices, such as minority groups, become weaker, and the story of propaganda almost from the government becomes the gospel, and this is the way it happens. But most significantly, backsliding has happened in Poland through the control of the judicial system, the Supreme Court. This has meant that people who face the courts now will face political decisions rather than constitutional decisions where their rights are upheld by the rule of law. This also means that the odds and the justice system is stacked up against political enemies, whereby they're using the courts to sustain political influence, and this is done under the guise of conservative and religious values. And so this has meant that Poland has been one of the top 10 autocratizing countries in the world, and they are experiencing severe democratic backsliding. But what's happened to the LGBT groups? So the Law and Justice Party led political campaigns of nationalism, populism, and conservative values being perpetuated throughout them. So how did they get support? Well, the economic benefits that they offer to rural conservative groups are probably quite beneficial for them. But more importantly, they stoked very much cultural wars against different minority groups, so they managed to perceive them as being a threat to democracy and a threat to religious values. They did this alongside the church. That's why I keep mentioning religious values, because the church, for example, has denounced LGBT groups as a rainbow Marxist plague. And so this has meant that the cultural war against LGBT groups has stoked up, and there's been numerous new policies against them. Policies were already quite limited for the LGBT groups in Poland, whereby whilst same-sex couples were accepted and acknowledged by the state, they couldn't marry or adopt. There were some loopholes around this, but they have since taken measures to close these, suggesting that the policies were indeed against LGBT groups specifically. Likewise, they've abolished the teaching of LGBT issues in schools, suggesting that from a younger age, the freedom to be an individual is, well, diminished. And all of this has become into this cultural battle whereby local institutions have formed LGBT ideology-free zones. In these zones, they've claimed that LGBT groups are non-existent there and indeed not welcome. This pays for a very difficult position that LGBT groups find themselves in, because if you're in there, you are either forced to be silent or you're forced to flee your home. So this essentially means that your democratic and civil rights in these zones are not protected. Whilst these zones are rather symbolic, it's quite damning if you're part of these groups, because you do not situate yourselves as an insider group person. You're forced to flee or become or hide who you are, and your rights are certainly not protected. And so some people have taken a stand up against this. Many people have gone on protests and things. However, there have been numerous policies against the different actions that activists take. For example, putting flags on monuments comes now with a prison sentence, and there's been increased use of pre-trial detentions for activists who they detain. And often in these big protests, they just seem to arrest most people, even if they're not directly involved in the protest. Human rights commissions have stated that the people detained are treated very badly. This means, for a democratic perspective, that the means to oppose and collectively organise yourself democratically to put forward your own political ideas has become weakened, and people are being suppressed and silenced for daring to oppose the mainstream political view of the government. This, alongside the judicial system of people facing harsher sentences or not getting their bails, means that people are much more scared to act out and forced to be moved to silence. So it seems like a common trend across Europe where there's democratic backsliding, religious monuments and statues seem to get more protection than minority groups. And likewise, as I mentioned, the control of the media represents the fact that minority groups have less of a way to channel their voices and channel their opposition to mainstream audiences, which means that they are much more easily able to be framed by the government institutions as the political enemy. They are framed as this aggressive ideology that comes from abroad and seems to attack them. It seems quite striking from an outsider perspective that Poland's so easily willing to discriminate and oppress another marginalised group, given that what's happened in their dark history, especially in the last 100 years. So, this means that in Poland, for the last few years, the courts have been controlled, the media has been controlled, and what I focus mostly is that minority LGBT groups have been suppressed and discriminated against. So, but the Polish people are still quite pro-European. They want to remain in the EU despite what the increasing EU resentment of the government party has done, especially how they're framing things like the LGBT as a foreign ideology, for example. But the EU has taken things against Poland recently, mostly about the Supreme Court, and the issues of LGBT rights has only been more of a symbolic gesture. For example, Ursula von der Leyen said that they were not welcome in the EU, and more recently the EU itself, through a parliamentary resolution, declared itself as a EU LGBT freedom zone, directly speaking out against the LGBT free zones in Poland. However, these are completely symbolic gestures. And I think that the EU is in quite an impossible decision where symbolic gestures are not enough, and if they were to take political or economic punishments for Poland, then it would very much play with the card of the EU being a corrupted foreign invader almost, which seeks to give Poland a bad deal. So it's very difficult because what can they do to help the Polish minorities? Well, if they do this, if they take financial political punishments, then they very much give the EU resentors ammunition to build up anti-EU rhetoric. So, overall, I'd say that LGBT rights being diminished in Poland very much comes as part of a white package. And this is important because in a democracy, we believe that our rights and our democracy strength comes from the values within them of toleration, for example, and every person's rights in a civic democracy should be protected, and the rule of law should apply to everyone. When it's been deliberately stacked against one minority group and in favour of a different group, it represents polarisation, which is very bad for democracy. And populism campaigns that ride off nationalist and conservative rhetoric targeted against one specific groups in the sheer guise to maintain power is also very bad for democracy. So thank you for listening. I hope you found a bit more about democracy, and this was a building paper of my blog post for my assessment.